We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Mike from Parallel Systems YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me today, Mike.
It's a pleasure to be back on the show, Tom. Thanks so much for inviting me.
You know, you and I had an excellent discussion last time, and I'm looking forward to, let's say, maybe updating your thoughts here. It's been quite a few months since you and I spoke, and you know, you speak on your channel quite a bit about the ramifications of the financial and systemic bubbles that have been inflated over the past 40 years here. So, you know, you really try to build a framework to think about and act to mitigate some of the negative effects of the coming collapse of some of these systems. So maybe we can try and figure out where maybe the best areas to focus on to mitigate some of the negative effects, as I was saying, of those collapsing systems. So, you know, over the last 2-3 years, there's been so much money that was printed, and obviously we're starting to see and really feel the effects of the inflation as a result of that. So how far do you think we are from seeing more inflation, and what do you see as the path ahead for inflation?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a turbulent path, because what we've got now is we've got the global economy going into a recession, and that's going to be different wherever you're based. I think some places are probably going to enter depressionary territory. And what we've seen recently is, because of the global debt crisis we've got, you know, the system from top to bottom is now insolvent, you know, as a consequence of kicking the can down the road, deregulation, crony capitalism, corruption on the political level. So really now we've got an insolvent banking sector, we've got a sovereign debt crisis, a personal debt crisis, and then we've got the central banks themselves that are going into negative equity. So we saw the Bank of England's losses, they're around 200 billion. And you've got the UK taxpayer that has to bail out the central bank in the UK. You know, this is one of the quirks of the UK system, is that we are actually on the hook for our central bank's losses on bonds. And, you know, the Federal Reserve says it's got around 720 billion in losses. Australian central bank in negative equity. The Czech central bank has been in negative equity for about 20 years. Canadian central bank, where you are, Tom, you're posting your first losses in your history, and on it goes wherever you look. So the system is insolvent. And what we're going to see as this starts to unravel is more and more problems surface that they just couldn't anticipate, similar to what happened in the UK with the LDI crisis. They just didn't anticipate that. And the central bank steps in and it has to firefight. And the reason for that is the system is so heavily interdependent now that if something fails, somebody else starts to fail. And then when they fail, someone else starts to fail. So, you know, it's gone from too big to fail to almost it's too big to survive. You know, the whole thing now is enmeshed with one another. So it's extremely difficult to predict what's going to come next. But what you can predict is that they're going to keep having to firefight and bail out the system. And as they do that, they're going to have to keep printing bucket loads of money. And that's going to lead to more inflation. So even though we've got this global recession and potentially a depression in some countries that is on the horizon, that might bring inflation down a bit. But then that's going to have knock-on consequences somewhere else. And every time they step in, I think we're going to see more and more spikes in inflation. And I just don't see a way out for the central banks now, which is why I personally think we're in the end game for the current system. And I think they know they're in the end game. I think they're setting up for what comes next. And all we can do is try and hypothesize what that's going to look like and try and protect ourselves as good as possible. And like you said, Tom, what I talk a lot about on my channel is protecting yourself in terms of your current wealth, obviously trying to increase your wealth if you can, although that's going to be increasingly difficult, although we can maybe get to it later in the show. But I do think there are ways where you can protect your wealth and also speculate too. Mm-hmm. And then also you've got to start protecting your way of life, because we're going to have so much inflation coming that many people are just going to be wiped out because of that inflation. But there are safeguards you can put in. You can start to decentralize your life, take back control of your energy, of your food production, water. I mean, these are all things that I've done. We have done that in our life. It's not easy, However, it gives us a lot more freedom. And because of that freedom, I'm able to focus more on the financial side of things as well. So that's something that I preach about a lot on the channel is don't just see this as your financial wealth. You also have to think about, your personal liberty and finding a high ground to fight some of these more tyrannical aspects of what's coming from, because that's going to have a much bigger impact on you than your financial situation, or at least it's going to be just as equal. I don't think there's any amount of wealth that I'm going to be able to create for myself that's going to save me from what they're planning in terms of CBDCs, digital IDs, having control over how I use my money. So you've got to kind of fight two fronts here. It's not just your financial situation. You also need to keep an eye on your independence and your personal liberty.
Well, and I think that's a really important point and something that you and I kind of touched on before we hit record here today, because, we think about protecting our way of life, but in reality, we need to be thinking about protecting our ability to continue to actually make the decisions that we want to make, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's absolutely critical, not just for ourselves, but also for future generations. We all inherited the freedom that we have. And it was really something that was handed on to us from our ancestors. They sacrificed so that we could be free, so that I could choose where I want to live, how I want to earn an income, so that I didn't have to live under totalitarian rules or dictatorships. And those things are all actually coming back to the fore now. We are certainly on the path in the West towards totalitarianism. And it's really been snuck under the door for most people. And the reason for that is because it's not come directly like people expected, based on what we saw in the 1930s and 40s, where you expected a dictator to come. It's been snuck in through liberalism and through trying to care for people more. People think that ceding their responsibility to the state and ceding their autonomy to the state is a good thing, not realizing that by doing so, they're actually giving up their freedoms. And once they're gone, they're never going to come back. And now, because we've got this fourth technological revolution coming in, it actually gives the state the power, or it will do. It'll give them the power to enact a form of totalitarianism, should they want to, that we probably will not escape from, not for many, many decades, maybe even centuries. So we have to be aware of what's coming down the pipeline. I talk a lot about central bank digital currencies, but it's actually much, much more vast than that. When you look at what they're trying to achieve in terms of the fourth industrial revolution and the technologies that are bringing in, it actually goes far beyond just your money. It's also about your ability to actually have ownership over yourself, your own body, to actually be able to access things like resources that you need for your family to survive. So we do talk about that a lot too. And yeah, I think, these are actually philosophical questions. They go beyond just the financial realm. It's about actually thinking about how much authority over us should the state have. And I know a lot of your viewers will certainly understand what I'm talking about. There'll be a lot of libertarians and people that have certain ideological views around that. But I think we can all come together, whichever stripe you are, and agree that some of the things we're seeing, such as the freezing of bank accounts, the constant propaganda trying to push people to follow certain agendas, this isn't democratic. It's totalitarian, and nobody wants that future. And we have to be very careful, because we're on a really slippery slope right now. And most of the population are not aware of just how vast the changes are going to be and how fast they're going to come at them in the coming decade or so. And at the minute, it's riding in on this vehicle of crisis, this constant crisis. We go from one crisis to another crisis, and then there'll be another one too. And the reason for that is the crisis is instrumental in getting people to acquiesce to these agendas. And, before we know it, we can easily go from A to F. We can jump decades, what we would have believed would have taken decades to achieve. It can be achieved in a very short time. So, that's something that I think we all need to be aware of and actually take responsibility ourselves for that, because that's the only thing that's going to push back against it, is enough people being aware and actually having the courage to stand out and say, I'm going to oppose this publicly. And, fortunately, there's a lot of people in our community. I'd say, the investing community, particularly the gold and silver space, has some of the most outspoken voices there. So that's something that I'm proud of, to be a part of that community.
Mm-hmm. So maybe, Mike, if we could get back to talking about some of the more specifics around, let's start with the banking system. I recently spoke with Alistair McLeod about the risk of bail-ins particularly in the UK banks. And that seems like it would, follow some type of hyperinflationary scenario, would it not?
Yeah, well, it could and it couldn't. It could come in before a hyperinflationary scenario. I mean, it depends how isolated the crisis was. Although I personally believe that any crisis of that magnitude would quite quickly affect the whole sector. I already used the example of the LDI crisis in the UK. The Bank of England actually came out a few weeks after and said, yeah, the whole commercial banking sector was about to go down without intervention. So that gives you an idea of just how fragile things are right now. And when it comes to things like bail-ins, people are really not aware of just how farcical some of these things are. So they talk about a bail-in, for example, and we're seeing that happen right now in Lebanon. So the Lebanese people have had their accounts frozen, particularly their dollar-denominated accounts. And they've been told, this actually began 2 years ago, but they've been told that those accounts are going to be converted back to the Lebanese pound. And that currency has been devaluing. I think it's something like 99% it devalued in a year. So, it's absolutely going to destroy the value of their holdings. And you actually had this phenomenon of people going into the banks with firearms or replica firearms and holding up the bank just to try and get their money out of the bank. It's actually destroying lives over there. So that is a bail-in. And that is what is happening in Lebanon. And we also saw it in Cyprus. And that is what they've legislated for in the West. Now, if they've legislated for it, you have to, whether they are going to do it or not, you have to believe they're going to do it because it's there and it's possible. So one of the things that the banking system purports to do is they say, right, well, your deposits are going to be insured. And we've all got these insurance schemes. So in the UK, we've got the FSCS guarantee scheme. And Alistair mentioned this on his show. And what they say is up to £85,000, we're going to protect your account. So you think, fantastic. Well, I don't need to worry about it. And that's exactly what they want you to think. However, I've looked into the scheme myself, and this is something that I think is really important to share with listeners. And you should be looking into your own scheme because everyone will be different depending on the country. But let's just imagine in the UK that there was a commercial banking collapse. That scheme is not funded by government. It's actually self-funded by levies. The government legislated to have it set up, but it's self-funded. And I looked into the scheme and what they take in levies, and essentially you've got enough to bail out every person in the UK by £7. So let's imagine you have a systemic banking crisis. There is no way that scheme is going to be able to fund the compensation that would be needed. And this was proven in 2008. What happened was it went from being something like an average year where they'd have to bail out maybe 50 million worth of claims to something like over $1 billion. And they had to lend that money from the government at interest. Unfortunately, the rest of the system was maintained so they could pay it back. However, if you think of a systemic banking collapse or a hyperinflation, your deposits are not going to be bailed out. And even if they are, where's the money going to come from? They're going to print it. So that will just hyperinflate the currency. So, in this way, these schemes are not going to protect you. At best, you're going to get some hyperinflated currency back. And at worst, you're going to get absolutely nothing. So this is something that people have to be aware of. You really have to take responsibility right now because the bell curve of risk in terms of what's coming down the pipeline, it shifted all of these tail end risks that could, people would have once said are extreme. They're actually right in the headlights now, as far as I'm concerned. I think they're going to bring down this system one way or another. I think we're going to have a global monetary reset of some sort. And we can only hypothesize what that is and prepare for it as best as we can.
Mike, you were talking about kind of the interconnectedness of the financial system as well. And, considering the, let's say, 4 quadrillions or so worth of derivatives, is the counterparty risk within the system another major source of risk for these financial institutions that you were talking about?
Yeah, 100%. There's so many counterparties in the system. And, this is one of the reasons why people like to share Exeter's pyramid, because they talk about having gold and silver and actually being outside of that interconnected counterparty risk, where it's so opaque. Like, we just don't know how many counterparties are in the system, particularly at the banking level. Like, we have no idea where their liabilities lie. And we have no idea how much they are on the hook for if somebody else goes under. But what we have seen in recent years is just some examples of how opaque this is. And also the idea that the central banks themselves don't actually know where all the risk lies. Now, that is the problem, because they can't prepare for it. All they can do is firefight once the risk begins to appear. And that's just talking about all the derivatives. But once you factor in things like the global monetary system in general, I'm talking about the dollar system, which people are now, countries are de-dollarizing across the world. And we've got the rise of BRICS. We've also got a war going on. So that in itself is just going to create meta instability in the system. And I think the day of the dollar is already done. We're just seeing the final days of it. So that's like a separate, we're talking about the commercial banking sector, but then we're also talking about the monetary system itself. And countries are starting to trigger the collapse of the current system. And, this is similar to what happened in the 1960s when you had the French under de Gaulle start to say, well, listen, we are going to convert our dollars to gold because you're printing too many dollars and we don't trust the system anymore. And that's what was happening. And they had the motivation and the will still to do it. They had the sovereignty at the time. Now, what the French did was they ended up converting about 70% of their own central bank's assets to gold. And this essentially tore apart the London gold pool, which was manipulating the price of gold to ensure that the Bretton Woods system could be sustained. And once the French came out of that, it really spelled the end of the gold pool. And I think we're seeing something similar now. What we're seeing is China and Russia and these nations start to de-dollarize. And that happened on the periphery. But now other nations are starting to say the same. We've seen Saudi Arabia say that they're going to start to accept yuan. That could turn into gold quite easily too. We've seen even African nations now saying that they're going to start to transact in gold over dollars. So I think that itself is another big risk to the system. And I think this is linked to all of these crises that we're seeing. They're all interconnected, whether that's the pandemic, whether that's the war. All of those are actually connected to the end of the current monetary system. And let's say the US and the East the East are trying to extricate themselves from the system before the collapse. And the US is trying to ensure that nobody leaves the system because they know that the day that the dollar is no longer the international reserve asset is the day their hegemony ends. So they're trying to set up what comes next. And they're kind of playing two games here. They're trying to stop the development of this other system, but they're also trying to maintain order and control over the West so that even if they don't remain as hegemon globally, they've still got control over this, let's say, American empire that spans across Europe and, to some degree, Canada and Australia too.
Mike, you kind of touched on there the idea of different countries using gold to transact with. Do you see that as being positive, obviously, for gold itself? And do you see that shift really starting to accelerate as these countries need a system and let's say a bedrock of trust to be able to transact together as, let's say, a starting point?
I think that's precisely what we're seeing here. And, it's funny, in recent years, central bankers have let slip some things that I don't think we would have had, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. And I often use the example of Adam Glapinski, who heads the Polish central bank. And when he was asked about why they were buying so much gold, I think they increased their holdings 10x in a very short space of time. And they also started to repatriate gold from the Bank of England, which many other countries have done too, which is very telling as well. But what he said was that the reason why they're buying gold is because gold is nobody else's liability. It diversifies them away from the dollar, but also, and this was what was really interesting, he said also, it will protect us should the financial system lights go out. Should there be some kind of catastrophic incident or collapse that leaves us with nothing else to use. Gold would be the asset of last resort, is essentially what he was saying. So I found that super interesting. And recently we had the guy from the Dutch central bank as well talk about the gold revaluation account, which was an interesting thing to discuss. Mm-hmm. So I think the central banks are very aware of what's coming. They're very aware of what's coming, at least on a national level. However, you've got to remember a lot of the central banks in Europe are beholden to the US. And what I mean by that is basically all of these nations are beholden to the US in terms of politically. Most of them are compromised and basically go along with whatever the US agenda is. And also, they are beholden to the US in terms of defense in Europe. So, Europe is in a really difficult spot. But if you move outside of Europe and you see what countries that are further away from US control are doing, it's the same. I mean, I'm not saying European central banks aren't buying gold. They're buying an awful lot of gold. But I think they have to be more guarded in how they do it. But if you look at, of course, let's go to the farthest end of the spectrum, China and Russia. I mean, they've been buying and mining their own gold for decades. And the amount of gold that they now hold, I think Alistair McLeod did a really good job on that. Where he said he thinks it's probably close to 30,000 tons now in China unofficially. So, this is telling us something. All of the writing is on the wall, in my opinion, that gold is going to be put back into the monetary system. In my personal opinion, I think it's going to be revalued. I think they're setting up for two scenarios, whether it's some kind of orderly transition from the current system to a new one, which I think would be central bank digital currencies. And by orderly, I don't mean it wouldn't be chaotic. It would be extremely chaotic, but they'd have much greater control over it. But then also there is the potential that the debt pyramids just collapse before they ever get to CBDCs. We're talking CBDCs, maybe 5-6 years at a minimum, in my opinion. But the financial system, can it be maintained for that long? Can they predict the crises that are coming and deal with them to keep it going that long? We don't know. So I think the central banks are actually preparing for that potential for the global financial system to crater. And that's all they're going to have left to start to use to trade with one another. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. I think personally, you have to read between the lines on some of this too, and not have recency bias that tomorrow's going to look like it did yesterday, because things could change overnight. We could have a bank holiday. You could go to the account, nothing comes out of that machine. And then just like the central banks, you're forced to go back to having something of real physical value to use to survive.
Well, and of course, the war on cash and the small amount of cash that most people use nowadays really makes people used to relying on those other systems, right? There's few people that really end up using cash, because in some ways it is inconvenient, and that ends up probably making people a lot more vulnerable than they think, right?
Yeah, and I think it's by design too. I mean, the war on cash, and I include in that the war on gold, that really started in the 1970s when the US made the decision to not go back to a gold standard after the end of Bretton Woods. And there's some really telling discussions that have been recorded, some meeting minutes between Henry Kissinger and his team, where they was talking about what are we going to do next. We've had the Bretton Woods system is over. What comes next? And most countries at that time wanted to go back to gold. France wanted to go back to gold. There was a number of European nations that wanted to go back to gold, but the US had the ultimate final say in it. And the only reason they didn't go back to gold was because they recognized that the European countries and nations had more gold collectively than the US did. And that was the last thing the US wanted, because it was all about, and always was about, US hegemony and soft US power, which they can enact by controlling and having a monopoly on the international reserve. And that was the only reason they didn't go back to gold, was because they recognized that a united Europe would then have more economic reserve might than they did. So of course we went to the petrodollar. And because of that, there was this whole war on gold enacted, and that was then extended to a war on cash. And now as we approach CBDCs, it's basically a war on anything that will take you outside of the system. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first is to trap people into the system. And if you look back historically at any of the past hyperinflations, they always do this. They did it in France in the early 1700s and again in the late 1700s. They actually made it illegal to use gold, and under threat of death. They said, we'll hang you or we'll chop off your head if you use it. They try and trap people in the system. And the reason for that is because it's a confidence trick. If people lose confidence in the currency, that takes you to hyperinflation much quicker. So what they're trying to do now is exactly the same. They want to trap people in the system. They want to maintain the system's integrity. At least outwardly, they want to maintain the appearances that it's still got integrity, but it doesn't. And to do that, they're enacting this war on cash. So in the European Union, for example, they've just reduced the amount you can use in cash transactions to 10,000 euros. But if you look at Italy, it's 5,000 euros, and it got put down to 1,000 euros for a cash transaction. Well, you can imagine with just a few years of inflation, Tom, that 1,000 euros doesn't get you a lot. Mm-hmm. And what this also does, it allows the state to monitor all of the assets that are in the system. So I think that's going to be a big part of the immediate future. I'm talking the next year or two. We're going to see a lot more in terms of the war on cash, a lot more in terms of the war on gold, cryptocurrencies, basically anything you can use to get yourself out of the system, they're going to be looking at. And the other thing that I think we're going to be seeing a lot of in the coming years, I think we're going to start to see people basically find themselves trapped between different regulations. So if you want to move money, I think that's going to be much more difficult. For example, financial repression. I think we're going to see a lot of financial repression. It's going to come in where it's going to be more difficult to move your money abroad. They're going to be asking a lot more questions if you're trying to withdraw cash. We've already seen this in the UK, at least. There's been many people getting in touch with me saying just withdrawing a fairly regular amount has led to all kinds of interviews and checks, being sat down for an hour trying to discuss where's your money going, what are you going to spend it on? These are personal questions that people shouldn't have to answer. But really, that actually shows us what the banking system is. You have given them your money, you've loaned them it, and now they want to know what you want that money back. And just one final aside, Tom, when the war in Ukraine started, there was a lot of people withdrawing significant amount of cash over here in Central Europe, where I am. And this goes back to their experience of hyperinflation. They were gearing up for what might come next. I found that quite interesting. People that have lived through past hyperinflations, past financial repression, those people are recognizing signs subconsciously that we may be entering a similar period. They're starting to see the signs in terms of the social turmoil and also in terms of the financial system. And I think there's been some big gold sales as well over here in Europe. I've noticed the dealers have been running out of gold. So that's just another sign that people are really starting to ask questions about this system. And once that confidence goes, then all of a sudden you could find yourself in a hyperinflationary event very, very quickly in the space of just a few years' time.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I recently posted an article on our Twitter page about Europe implementing a carbon tax on every item that people buy. So is this something that you see as the beginning of just more costs for the average person, along with other ramifications like food shortages, as the Netherlands, for example, is taking aim at farmers?
Yeah, I think this is going to have a profound impact on people. And I think this is one area where people are not pricing in what is actually happening globally. To give you an example, in Great Britain, they've stated that over the next 7 years, they want to reduce the individual's carbon footprint from 8.5 tons of CO2 per year to 2.5 tons per year. That's a 70% decrease in 7 years. And if you think about what that would do to a person's lifestyle, the kind of shifts that would have to be made to achieve that is astronomical. That's taking the UK to basically the CO2 output per person of a developing country like Indonesia, where you've got an average monthly salary of around $500. But then it gets even more wild, Tom. They're going to take it from 8.5 to 2.5. Then over the next 20 years, after that, from 2030 to 2050, they want to take it down to 0.7. I mean, can you imagine what somebody's life would look like with so little output of CO2? I mean, I can tell you what it's going to look like. It's going to look like a developing country. It's going to look like a third world nation in some respects. You may have, there may be ways to mitigate some of it, but it's going to have profound impacts on people. And I think when it comes to things like inflation and the food price inflation, I really think they're going to let these kind of things run hot. I don't think there's going to be much reprieve for the average person. And I think the reason for that is because by forcing people into these economic situations of hardship, it allows them to control things much more. And going into this future where they have such radical ideas of how they want to change the world, they're going to have to, in some way, force people. They're going to have to force people because nobody is going to willingly deprive themselves that much. I think right now there's a lot of people who are ideologically on board, like we want to save the planet. It all sounds great, but they have no idea that these have been written into law now in Europe, and this is going to happen. And the only way to do it is really to force people. And they're going to do that through crisis. And they're also going to do that economically. If they stretch people economically, then they can force them, because then they can say, right, well, we'll help you out, but only if you take option B over option A. And I think we're going to see a lot of that too, giving people handouts, but only if they do the right thing. They'll give them subsidies, but only for certain options. So I think it's a very dangerous time to be alive. And, in terms of inflation, the best thing you can do is start to take back control over the things that they currently have control over. So if that's your energy, you can start to build an off-grid lifestyle. That's what we do over here. We grow our own food. We produce a lot of our own food, our own water system. It's our own well. We pay to get it dug. It's a big outlay initially, but now I don't have to pay for any water. All of these things can be done, and they will insulate you an awful lot from these future scenarios that we're talking about. Also, we're going to see a lot more distortions in the market because of these crises and because of this future that they're trying to implement. There are going to be opportunities too, particularly in real assets, particularly in commodities. And if you can foresee what's coming, if you read their own literature and see the future that they want to bring into being, you can actually find ways to profit from it too, while still protecting your wealth. It's not speculation, but there are real assets. And I've noticed a number of distortions over here, Tom, in terms of different asset classes.
So maybe we could go over some of those, Mike. You mentioned particular distortions. So what do you mean by those?
Yeah, so just to give you an example, recently we had the war in Ukraine break out, of course, and there was a massive exodus of people to countries of Europe. So in my country where I'm living, I think 2 to 4 million Ukrainians, I'm not sure the exact final number, but they came across, and that's had profound impacts on things like the rental market. Rental properties skyrocketed in price. And my wife's parents, they own a rental property, and they were having to re-let the rental property. And just to give you an example of how crazy the market got over here, they had, in about 3 hours, 100 different inquiries. You just literally cannot get a rental property, and the rents have gone sky high. The same things happened in Ireland. I've got a friend over in Ireland. He said he went to view a house. There was 50 people queuing up to see one house. That's how hard it is in major cities of Europe to get rental properties. So that's created a distortion in the market. Also, we're seeing big distortions in things like land prices over here. The land prices over the past 2 to 3 years have gone up 400%. It's absolutely wild. To give you an example, we were recently buying some more land for our farm. And because of the length of the administrative process to buy that land, it's taken about 9 months or so. The land value is almost doubled in that period of time. That's 9 months. Literally, if we hadn't put a deposit on it and the owner was actually looking at the markets, maybe they'd take it back off and resell it. You literally cannot buy land for the price that it was 9 months ago. Mm-hmm. So these are real distortions in the market that we're seeing over here. Another good example is the price of wood. Just pure firewood. Firewood, because of the energy crisis, it's gone up 200-300% in some places, particularly in Germany. That's another distortion that you can take advantage of if you could foresee the future. In fact, when we was looking at land ourselves, we wanted to buy forest that we could use to harvest firewood, so we don't have to pay those future prices. It's thinking ahead. It's trying to invest in things that potentially could help you now. Like we did, we bought a forest so we can actually harvest our own wood. But also, we can use that real asset to speculate on land prices if we wanted to. Also, we can use it as farmers to grow food. And if the price of commodities are going up, if the price of food is going up, then you can use that also. So it's just thinking ahead, Tom, thinking outside the box a little bit and trying to prepare yourself for future distortions in the market. And you can front run those.
So is that really, let's say, part of the bedrock of how you see your investing landscape going forward is having a lot of these hard assets to be able to anticipate and counteract some of those distortions you just mentioned?
For me personally, that is definitely how I see it. I mean, in the past, of course, I've invested in gold and silver miners is probably the space that I'm most interested in. But even there, we are seeing distortions in prices. I remember I put on a trade back in 2001. It was when the commodities had all run up a lot and they were pulling back, and it felt like we'd hit a bottom in certain stocks, particularly I noticed in Newmont at the time. And the price of Newmont just was unreasonably low, it seemed to me. And looking at I don't do a lot of technical analysis, but I do fundamental analysis. And it seemed to me like, we'd hit a floor. I didn't expect us to break the support. And I put a trade on. And then literally, Tom, in about 9 months, the position was up 50%. This is one of the biggest miners on planet Earth. That is not a normal price increase, 50% in the space of 9 months. You might expect that from a junior or a mid-tier. And this was not just in Newmont, it was in a number of positions. So, for example, we've got a stock in the UK called Yellowcake, which buy and hold uranium. That's literally all they do. Again, that was up about 90% in the same space of time. These are distortions, and we're going to see these things come up. So it's not like you cannot benefit from traditional asset classes and in the equities market. But when we go back to what we spoke about at the start of this show, there's so much risk right now. There is a really big risk that we just have this collapse moment in the markets. So I don't think the average investor should really be looking to their equity positions to bring them that speculative gain, unless they're able to move in and out of positions. You know, if you're a trader, if you read the markets and you're quite happy to take on that risk, that's fair enough. However, if you're just a buy and holder, there's an awful lot of risk in the markets. So personally, I would much rather be looking at real assets that you can actually see, you can actually touch. They can't be, the counterparties are minimal. You know what I mean? You can't be locked out of your positions. If you look at what happened in Russia at the start of the war, I know people, and I think you had a guy on your show, Tom, who was locked out of his positions. And when his brokerage account opened back up, he was down 90% on some of those positions. You know, there's a big miner over there. I can't remember the name of it. Polymetal. Polymetal dropped about 95% in the space of about 3 days. If he was locked out of your position, you've just lost 95% of your holding. Could we see this in the West? Could we see this with our brokerages? If the crisis is big enough, I think we could. So that's why I think it's a really good time to be looking at real assets. I think first and foremost, you need to have a position in physical metals. And those physical metals need to be within your control and access. You need to be able to access them. You know, there's a lot of companies out there now that are doing vaulted metals. Well, that's all well and good, but you've still got a lot of counterparties there. And in a crisis, there is not going to be a bricks van turning up at your house delivering your metals, not unless you've got millions and you're willing to pay 50 grand for the bricks van to travel from Switzerland with armored guards. You know what I mean? You've got to really think these things through. If you want to protect yourself in a crisis, you need to have access to those assets. And, you know, even if you are looking at other real assets such as land, there's still a counterparty there. You know, I always say to my wife, like within 30 minutes, well, probably within 10 minutes of walking from my house, I can read German, I can read Polish, and I can read Russian. So what does that tell you? At 3 different moments over the past 100 years, this territory has been owned by somebody else. You know, right now it's Polish, but it was German in the 1920s. It was Russian in the 1960s. So even the land has a counterparty, and you can be thrown off your land. You know, I actually live in a part of Poland where Germans were sent out of this land, and most of the houses around here and farms used to be owned by Germans, and they got kicked off the land. So there's a counterparty risk for you, you know, that could happen again. So you have to play these things out in your mind. You have to think it through. However, the safest place to be right now is real assets, and you can still speculate using them. Land prices, commodities, they're all going to go up, in my opinion, over the next decade. I think it's baked into the cake at this point. And you can play that in creative ways.
So, Mike, what role does silver play to you? Do you really put an importance on needing physical silver as well as gold?
I think I certainly see them as having a different purpose. I think gold is really important for protecting wealth, and you know, the higher value of gold allows you to protect more wealth that way. But I don't think you're going to be trading that in a crisis. Now, when it comes to silver, I think having a portfolio that has silver that could be used in a bartering situation. Also, junk silver, I'm very fond of too, particularly junk silver of the country that you're in. And if it's in Great Britain, you can go back and get the old crowns. If it's in Germany, it's the old Deutschmarks. I think that's really useful to have, really useful, because if we do go into this crisis moment where things do start to freeze up, people will still accept silver. You know, where I am, if I walked around with some old junk silver, I could go buy some milk from a farmer. You know, I could go buy some eggs. I could go buy some geese if I had to in a crisis. But what I couldn't do is go use cryptocurrency. They'd have no idea what it was. You know, they'd take something physical, but they certainly wouldn't be taking something like that. I think they'd look at me with glazed eyes if I even mentioned it. So I think having silver as that diversifier, which gives you the ability to trade and barter, is really important. And I think it's something that many people probably would think sounds absurd. However, if you go back to countries east of Germany, all of those countries pretty much have been through those times where they've had to do such things. They've had hyperinflations. People have had to live this way. And it's not absurd to those people. As I speak to people in these countries across here, talking Hungary, I'm talking the Czech Republic, all of those countries, those people have had experience where the currencies have gone to zero, and they will use real hard assets to store their wealth outside of the system. And the other great thing about silver is it does give you that speculative element too, because I truly think silver is going to be absolutely mega metal in the coming years because of all the uses. And if you look at the fourth industrial revolution and the things that they're going to actually try to achieve, it requires an awful lot of silver. And then we've also got the green technologies in terms of solar panels, electric vehicles. So, there is a speculative element, and it also gives you protection from the coming crisis as I see it. Mm-hmm.
Mike, again, we kind of touched on the idea that there are more conflicts and this coming maybe decade is a decent way to say it, of instability and conflict. How big of a role do you think war is going to play in this decade ahead? We've already seen this escalation of the war in the Ukraine, and more conflicts seem to be on the horizon. So maybe you could share with us if there are any historical periods that we can use kind of as a guide to what might lie ahead here.
Yeah, I think probably the best period that I could come up with, and it's a more recent one, so I've got more access to information on it, but it feels very much like the 1920s and 30s period. You've got this threat of totalitarianism lingering in the background. These big ideologies that promise utopian visions. And you've also got the superpower of the West and of the world, in this case, going to war with a rising superpower. And people might say, well, what you're talking about, this is this is a Russian and Ukraine conflict. However, I think people are drinking too much Kool-Aid right now in terms of, I think most of you guys will understand that there is another element to this, that this war has a history that goes back long before 2022. And the way that you frame this war will help you to understand how it could move forward. If you have a thesis as to why the war is happening, then you'll have a different view of how it will probably result in the future. So if you do see this as the US trying to enact its hegemony, trying to hold back the development of a new monetary system, trying to control as much as possible the transition of power and the capital base from west to east, which is happening anyways. Those trends were in place long before this current period. And the US really, in my opinion, has a grand strategy. And the grand strategy is to try and retain as much power as possible over the next 30, 40, 50 years. Now, at present, there's a war going on in Ukraine that is weakening one of the key countries in terms of the development of the new system. And also, if you look at what the new system is going to look like, Russia is going to be awfully powerful in that new system. Also, they're a key commodity provider for China. So by default, if the US could get Putin ousted, for example, then all of a sudden you've got the ability to put in some US oligarchs in there. Then you could have an American-friendly government or state in Russia that would allow American corporations to come in. Because remember, Russia really has a complete natural resource profile. It's almost complete, and it's got about double in terms of underground value what the US has. So if we went to this new system where the BRICS nations were enacting a new monetary reserve that was based not just on gold, but on other commodities too, to try and draw in these other countries, that would be awfully beneficial for a country like Russia. And you could quite easily foresee how the US, because of its ownership over these debt pyramids in the West, could not just fall off top spot. It could fall 3 or 4 places down the ladder. And then over time, it could almost end up in this like post-Soviet situation. Because although the US does have a lot of resources, the financial consequences of the collapse of the debt pyramid would be much deeper felt in the US and Europe than it would in, say, China or Russia. So really what I see is the US is in this really difficult situation where it's got this specter of a debt collapse behind it, and it's trying to force itself and rush to try and hold off the development of something new in the East. And therefore, this is a really dangerous time in history, because what's going to happen first? If the US is rushing here, there's the chance for catastrophic error. Also, the US, and I'm saying the US, obviously the war's being enacted in Ukraine. However, there is so much money coming in from the US and they can just print that money. However, if the debt pyramid collapses and the dollar goes to zero, they're not going to be able to print the money. So I think we're in this really dangerous 10-year spot. Also, we've got other countries of Europe now that are building up their land army. Are they going to get put into the war at some point? We've got the largest land army in Europe now being developed in Poland. So they want to have 250,000 people. And they're bringing back national service for certain people in society. If you don't do it, you're going to get fined. You're going to potentially go to jail. So, this is a really precarious moment in history. Is the US going to pursue this, or should I say, is this war just going to, I'm trying to be careful with my words here because some of it's speculative. However, I think we all agree that this is really the last chance saloon for the US, in my opinion. If they want to consolidate their power for the next 20, 30 years, this is really their last shot at doing it. And if they fail over there in this war, if Ukraine failed, then all of a sudden you've got a very different landscape. But if they succeed, similarly, you've got a very different landscape. You've also, all of a sudden the rise of China, the rise of BRICS, that's going to look very different if we have a more Western-friendly government in Russia. Yeah, extremely different. Remember, there's a southern border in Russia too that is bordering China. So, China's pretty much surrounded then. And then you've got the Taiwan situation, which the US could basically reenact as it is doing. It could fund Taiwan defense again. So I think these are all things that you have to be aware of and you have to think about. It has the potential to go many ways. And the way that I frame it is, it's what comes first. Do we have this reckoning with the financial system first, or can it be dragged out long enough for this war to continue for another 5 to 10 years? Because it could foreseeably do that, and it could start to escalate and involve a lot more countries.
Yeah, and as you're kind of explaining your thinking around if the US gained more power or more sway in Russia, I'm sure there are countries that have really begun to cooperate with Russia that would see that as a threat to them as well, like China.
Yeah, I think it would change the power of balance dramatically. Yeah, and I think in that scenario, let's just imagine that is what happened. That Russia does get rid of Putin, and there is somebody that's more sympathetic to the US in power over there. Then I could quite easily see how the US could continue hegemony for maybe another 20, 30 years. Because really, China, as powerful as China is, it really does require this new monetary system to be brought into being for it to be able to really release itself from the shackles that it's currently in. To be dependent on the US dollar, or if we go to a digital dollar, for example, let's say the current system collapses. If China's still a part of that system, it will certainly, and surrounded, don't forget, you've got the US over there in Japan, you've got the US in South Korea, then you've got potentially the US in Russia as well. That's an awfully vulnerable situation for China. And yes, I think it would change the landscape a lot. So, it's all, I guess it's all yet to be seen what happens here. Mm-hmm. But it's dangerous for us, just for everyday people that want to get on with their lives. They want to work hard. They want to provide for the family. It creates this instability. I think that instability is part of it too. I think that's actually very useful. And it's more than just the war. Don't forget, we've got a lot of social instability. We've got a lot of different factions of society that are being pitted against each other in a very chaotic manner. If you've looked at the scenes coming out of Europe recently as well, over the weekend in Paris, we had riots in the streets. This was just on the back of riots from another community in Paris. This is from the mass migration. You've got the same issues in America. These are all destabilizing things too. And again, I think this is part of the plan to try and keep people continuously off balance so that they can't really figure out what's going on. They can't really see through lots of the propaganda. They can't come together and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I agree with what's happening. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that too. And that's going to be across the world, but particularly in Europe and the West, let's say in America too. Probably Canada, although not so much. You guys have a lot of space out there, which I think makes it a little bit easy for you. But in countries where you've got lots of the population packed into cities, they're going to be dangerous places to be in the coming decade, Tom. And I think if somebody is based in the city, now's really the last chance potentially to be thinking, do I want to be in this kind of area with all of these risks that are now starting to transpire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Another point that you and I kind of touched on before we hit record here today was the idea that you don't necessarily need to understand everything that's going on, every detail of what's going on. It's probably better to understand the high level, let's say, trajectory of what's going on, and more importantly, to act to protect yourself from this stuff.
Yeah, I think taking action is the biggest component of this, and that's where people struggle most. Is taking real action. And the way that we talk about it a lot over here is taking real responsibility, and we spoke about this before the show, is taking real responsibility for your situation, because there's not anybody that's coming along to save us in this. There's a lot of people who are hoping for somebody to come along and fix it. They hope that we're going to go back to 2019, but some of these changes and some of these trends that are in play, they're not going away. If you look at the agendas that are being laid out, it's all very clear where we're heading. So you've got to make of that what you want. It's up to you. Do you want to be a part of those things? Or do you want to take back more control in your life? Do you want to take yourself outside the system a little bit more, decentralize your life a bit more, and prepare for some of these crises? Like, right now we still have the freedom to do that, but there is no guarantee that in 2 years or 6 months or even tomorrow, Tom, that a crisis doesn't come along. All of a sudden the world's getting locked down again, as they called it, and people are being told you can't travel. There is no guarantee that isn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, this is why you've got to be prepared for anything. Like, we really are living in this era of crisis. That's what I call it. It's an era of crisis, 10 years at least, but it could go on much longer. So, start to think about your life, start to think about where you want to be, and also give yourself some flexibility too, because it may be that in the future you actually want to leave the location you're in. And that's not so easy. I know people that were stuck in Australia for 2 years. They wanted to leave. It took them 2 years to get out. I've got somebody who's a part of my group over here. I've got a Patreon page and also a private group, and we're discussing these things. And a lot of those people are people who are making real life-changing decisions, whether that's financially, but also a lot of that's to do with their location and how they live. And I had somebody go from Australia to Siberia recently. These are big changes that people are making. And that should be something that the viewers take heed of too, is, just really consider where you're located, how your money is balanced across different positions and asset classes, and also just start to allow yourself to predict what the future could look like. Don't wait for somebody to tell you, because I don't know and you don't know. None of us know, but we can see trends. We can see things start to unravel. We certainly can see the risk of certain things coming. So, prepare for them as best you can, and then live your life. You've got to live as well. You don't want to be trapped in this state of crisis and fear, because, that's not helpful for you or your family either. So I think, prepare as best you can, and then enjoy life as much as you can.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And I appreciate you, sharing your thoughts with our audience based around that, because again, I think acting is more important than trying to understand every minuscule detail. But I think that's a pretty good place to kind of wrap up today's conversation. Mike, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on that we didn't?
No, I think that's everything covered that I hoped we could speak about, Tom. So Merry Christmas to you and the other listeners. And I hope we all have a fantastic 2023, despite what's going on in the world. I think if you take action, you get yourself prepared, and you also start to build community. I think that's really key. Community of like-minded people, such as the community you've built around this channel. I think then you can ride this one out. I think there is a way to do it, but you have to take action, like you said. I think that's probably the best place to leave it. Yeah,
absolutely. I think community, and just considering the fact that you're not alone in thinking and trying to consider ways to mitigate the negative effects here, that's going to be really important. And of course, you do a great job of that as well. And we're always, let's say, available to answer any questions or anything like that. Your Twitter handle is @parallel_Mike. And again, your YouTube channel, Parallel Systems, excellent resource for people that are thinking about these kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, you can always give me a message on Twitter. Like I said, we do try and focus mainly on not just getting ourselves prepared in terms of the financial side, but also about that practical side. I didn't come from a rural background. We completely shifted our life from the city to a very rural location where we fend for ourselves pretty much in terms of meeting our own energy and food needs. So for people that are interested in that, you can always get in touch with me on Twitter, or you can drop me an email too. And I've also got my channel, but this will probably be going to podcast soon because YouTube doesn't seem to like some of the content, Tom. So I think I need to decentralize my podcast too.
Excellent. Mike, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Tom. I appreciate it.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.